Did you know that when you click buy on an ebook, you don't actually own it in the same way you own a physical paperback?
Right, yeah. It really feels like you do, though.
Exactly. I mean, you look at your reading app and you see this neat little digital shelf. All your purchases are just sitting there. It looks like ownership. But legally and structurally, it is an entirely different beast.
Oh, totally.
The book you quote unquote bought can be edited or censored or even completely deleted from your device without your permission, like long after your credit card was charged.
Yeah, and I think that's because we operate with this really outdated mental model. Like human beings are just deeply accustomed to the physical world, right? A world of atoms.
Right. Things we can actually hold.
Exactly. If you buy a physical book, you hold it, you can lend it to a friend, you can doodle in the margins or, toss it in a box and sell it at a garage sale 20 years later.
Yeah, it's yours.
But the moment we transition to the digital world, which is a world built entirely on bits and code, all those physical rules just completely evaporate.
Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are exploring a stack of source material that fundamentally shifts how we think about the information we consume every single day.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. We are looking at this incredibly comprehensive set of exam notes, and they were designed for senior students in library and information science. So the overarching topic here is information ethics.
And, anyone listening right now might assume information ethics is this kind of obscure, dusty topic.
Yeah.
Like it's just reserved for librarians shushing people behind a reference desk.
Right, like it doesn't apply to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in reality, it is the ultimate survival toolkit for navigating modern digital life. I mean, these sources detail how this massive shift from physical atoms to digital bits is forcing us to completely rewrite the moral rulebook.
The rule book for how we create and store and access all human knowledge,
Oh,
really.
exactly. It's huge.
So let's unpack the raw material of our digital lives here, because I think we have to start with the foundational question, who actually owns digital information?
Right.
The exam notes frame this as a massive ethical tension between two conflicting viewpoints. The commons perspective and the proprietary perspective.
Yeah, and the way we classify that information basically dictates who gets to use it.
Yeah.
So the commons argument suggests that digital information should be treated as a public good, much like the air we breathe or the water in a river.
Okay, I can see that.
Economists actually use the term non-rivalrous to describe this.
Non-rivalrous. What does that mean exactly?
So if you eat an apple, I cannot eat that same apple.
Right, it's gone.
Exactly, it is rivalrous. But if I read a digital article online, my consumption doesn't diminish your ability to read that exact same article.
Oh, because it's just infinitely copyable.
Right, at zero cost. So the ethical argument there is that it belongs to a digital commons that should be accessible to everyone.
But the proprietary side clearly disagrees with that, right? I mean, the counter-argument in the sources is that without strong intellectual property laws, creators just won't get paid.
Yeah, that's the flip side.
If an author or a researcher can't monetize their hard work because everything is instantly free, I mean, they'd simply stop producing. And the economists call that the tragedy of the underproduced.
And that tension has fundamentally broken how we handle property rights today. Because for centuries, copyright law relied on something called the first sale doctrine.
The first sale doctrine.
Yeah, basically, when a library or just a private citizen bought a physical book, they owned that specific physical copy.
Okay.
The publisher controlled the copyright to the story itself, but the buyer owned the physical object. So you could lend that object out 1,000 times without paying the publisher another dime.
But digital rights management, or DRM, totally overrides that first sale doctrine, doesn't it?
Completely.
Because when a library pays for an ebook today, they aren't actually buying a copy. They are buying a license.
Yes, a highly restrictive license.
Right. The code wrapped around the file dictates exactly how many times it can be checked out, or even how long the library is allowed to hold it before they literally have to buy it again.
It's crazy. We are transitioning away from a culture of ownership into a culture of permanent licensing. The publisher retains total control.
Wow.
And the ethical dilemma outlined in the notes here is that modern law is heavily favoring the publisher's profit margins over the public's fundamental right to access information.
It sounds identical to signing a perpetual rental agreement for a house, but your landlord retains the right to come in and change the locks at any time.
That's a great way to put it.
Or like the landlord embeds a sensor in your living room and dictates that you're only allowed to have one guest over per month. And if they decide they don't like the house anymore, they just demolish it with all your stuff inside.
Yeah, it's terrifying when you think about it like that.
Yeah.
That structural fragility leads directly to what archivists call the digital dark age.
The digital dark age. That sounds ominous.
It is. Digital formats are just terrifyingly vulnerable compared to parchment or paper. Information professionals basically face two massive existential threats to the historical record.
Yeah.
Technological obsolescence and bit rot.
Okay, obsolescence is somewhat intuitive, I think. Like the hardware changes. I can't read a floppy disk today, even if I found one in my attic, just because the drives don't exist on modern computers.
Right, the physical bridge to the data is just gone.
Exactly. But bit rot, that sounds like a biological disease infecting a computer or something.
Well, the mechanism is honestly just as insidious as a biological disease. Because at a microscopic level, digital files are just billions of magnetic or electrical charges representing ones and zeros.
Right.
And over time, the physical media storing those charges actually degrades. Magnetic fields weaken. Or, crazy enough, a cosmic ray hits a server.
Wait, really? A cosmic ray?
Yeah, and suddenly a 0 silently flips to a 1 on a hard drive somewhere.
Oh, wow.
And if that happens in a critical line of code or a historical digital photograph, the file just becomes corrupted and entirely unreadable.
So, are we ironically leaving behind fewer permanent records than ancient civilizations did with their stone tablets? I mean, a tablet carved in Mesopotamia can survive buried in sand for 4,000 years.
Yep.
But a hard drive in a climate-controlled server farm might lose its data in, what, a decade?
Pretty much. Unless someone is actively fighting that decay, the historical record will simply vanish.
That's wild.
And this introduces the information professional's duty of care. They operate under this strict ethical mandate known as the CIA triad.
CIA.
Yeah.
Like the agency.
No, in this case, it stands for protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Oh, okay.
So to fight obsolescence, archivists have to constantly and painstakingly migrate data from old formats to new ones. And to fight bit rot and maintain the integrity of a file, they rely on a mathematical mechanism called checksums.
Checksums. Okay, but how do they actually know a file is degrading before it's completely ruined? You can't have a librarian manually opening and reading every single digitized book or photograph in an archive every single day just to check for digital typos.
No, of course not. That's where the checksum comes in. It functions as an automated digital fingerprint. When a file is first archived, a computer runs a complex mathematical formula on the underlying ones and zeros, and that results in a unique string of characters. That string is the sum.
Got it.
The archive system then periodically recalculates that exact same math problem in the background. And if even a single pixel in an image degrades or one letter in a document rots, the resulting checksum will be drastically different.
Oh, that's incredibly smart.
Yeah. The system immediately alerts the archivist that the historical record has been altered, which allows them to restore it from a pristine backup. Because without active automated auditing, history just erases itself.
Man, well, if the digital items we interact with are this fragile and we don't even truly own them in the first place, that introduces a much creepier element from the exam notes.
Oh, absolutely.
Because who owns the data we generate while we are reading all this licensed, monitored content? The sources point straight to the panopticon effect.
Yeah, the panopticon. So that was originally an 18th century prison design.
Right.
The cells were arranged in a circle around a central guard tower. And the prisoners could never see inside the tower, so they never knew exactly when they were being watched.
That is so deeply unsettling.
It was meant to be. Because they might be observed at any given second, they regulated their own behavior. They basically acted as if they were always under surveillance.
And the notes argue that in the digital age, the panopticon isn't just Big Brother, meaning like massive government surveillance. It's little brothers.
Yes, exactly. Private corporations.
Tracking every click, every search query, every highlight you make in an ebook, and literally how many seconds you spend lingering on a specific page.
And that surveillance is heavily monetized.
Yeah.
The most frustrating part for privacy advocates is that we actively participate in our own monitoring.
We really do.
The LIS notes refer to this as the privacy paradox. Users routinely tell pollsters that they deeply value their personal privacy. They want their data protected. But then, the second a website offers a 10% discount code or a slightly more convenient login process, users instantly click Accept All Cookies without reading a single line of the terms of service.
Yeah, we trade our digital souls for minor conveniences, like all the time.
They do.
The solution proposed for information professionals here is privacy by default. A library shouldn't exploit that human psychological weakness. The most secure private setting should be the standard baseline, not some toggle switch buried under 10 submenus.
Right. And, all that data we bleed out isn't just sitting in a server farm gathering dust. It is the raw fuel for artificial intelligence.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah. The exam notes describe a profound ontological shift in how human beings interact with knowledge. Because AI is no longer functioning as a simple tool, it has actually become an independent agent. We're witnessing a fundamental shift from search to synthesis.
Okay, so traditional search engines act like highly efficient filing cabinets. You type a query, it finds 10 documents, provides the blue links, and steps back. And then you have to evaluate the sources and synthesize the answer yourself. But modern AI language models do the reading for you and spit out a synthesized conversational answer.
Right. And that synthesis creates an enormous ethical risk known as the loss of source. When the AI gives you an answer, the underlying citations are just script away.
Okay, I have to push back on this being an inherent crisis, though. Let's look at it from the user's perspective.
Okay, sure.
I use AI to summarize incredibly dense articles all the time. If an AI gives me the exact, perfectly synthesized answer I need in 2 seconds, and I don't have to wade through 5 different ad-riddled websites to find it, why should I care about losing the original source?
Wow.
Isn't it the massive gain in productivity and convenience ultimately better than forcing everyone to do the tedious digging themselves?
The convenience is unparalleled, right up until the exact moment the machine lies to you.
Ah.
It is crucial to understand the mechanism behind how a large language model works. An AI doesn't actually know facts. It doesn't have a database of truth that it references.
Right, it's just predicting.
Exactly. It is a statistical engine designed to predict the next most likely word in a sequence based on the billions of texts it ingested. And because it is guessing, based on statistical probability, it frequently suffers from hallucinations.
Meaning it just makes things up.
Yes, it will generate incredibly confident, highly detailed, but entirely fictional information.
So if you don't have the original source link right there to verify the claim, you are completely at the mercy of the machine's statistical guessing game.
Exactly. You lose the ability to think critically about where the information came from or what the author's actual agenda might have been.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that is a problem.
Furthermore, AI systems act as a mirror, reflecting the data they were trained on. And human data is deeply historically flawed.
Right, of course.
The sources focus heavily on algorithmic bias. Modern AI systems exhibit a massive white-centric bias because they're predominantly trained on Western English language datasets. So they overrepresent one specific cultural viewpoint while actively marginalizing indigenous knowledge, non-Western perspectives, and minority voices.
Yeah, so if an algorithm is trained on decades of historical human data that systemically ignored or prejudiced certain socioeconomic groups, its future predictions and synthesized answers will mathematically continue to ignore and prejudice those exact same groups.
Precisely. The bias is basically laundered through the machine to look like objective code.
Laundering the bias. That's a great phrase.
And the privacy implications of these agents are equally severe. AI basically threatens to end the concept of anonymity altogether.
Really? How so?
Well, companies often release massive data sets claiming they are anonymized because they stripped out the names and social security numbers.
Okay, that sounds safe.
It's not, because AI agents are incredibly adept at cross-referencing multiple disparate data sets. By analyzing location pings, purchase histories, and search habits, the AI can easily re-identify specific individuals. It destroys any illusion of privacy.
Good grief. So what is an information professional supposed to do in the face of an all-knowing, hallucinating, highly biased AI agent that remembers absolutely everything?
Well, the LIS framework advocates for the human-in-the-loop model.
Human in the loop.
Yeah, you cannot abandon the technology, but you absolutely cannot leave it unsupervised. The AI handles the massive computational scale of sorting the data, but human professionals have to handle the nuance, the empathy, and the ethical auditing.
So the modern librarian is essentially acting as a mini-ethicist.
Exactly. They must continuously audit algorithms for bias, actively fight surveillance capitalism, and teach the public how these systems actually work under the hood.
But that raises a massive upstream question for me. AI systems learn by ingesting our massive troves of human data, and where does the most authoritative human data come from?
Academia. Scientific research.
Right. So if the AI is learning from that pipeline, we need to know if the humans creating the research are acting ethically in the first place.
And the exam notes argue they're operating in a deeply compromised system. The lifeblood of academic research is really buckling under the immense pressure of a publish or perish culture.
Publish or perish.
Academics must constantly churn out new papers just to secure tenure or maintain their jobs or win grant funding.
And the pressure to produce leads to an ethical breach the notes call salami slicing.
Yes, salami slicing.
I love this analogy. Imagine a television network takes a really tight, incredibly compelling 2-hour movie plot. But instead of releasing one high-quality film, they chop it up and drag it out into a bloated 10-episode series just so they can sell more commercial breaks.
It's the worst.
It is. And salami slicing in academia is the exact same concept.
Right. A researcher conducts one solid, comprehensive study, but instead of publishing one definitive paper, they slice the findings into the smallest publishable units.
Like 4 or 5 separate, watered-down papers.
Exactly.
Ugh.
It artificially inflates the author's publication count, which looks great on a resume, but it completely clutters the scientific record. It makes it so much harder for other scientists to synthesize the actual findings.
The metrics become the goal instead of the actual science. And it gets even worse with something called p-hacking, which is basically manipulating the data analysis mechanism itself.
Yeah, p-hacking is often described as the practice of torturing the data until it confesses.
Wow, torturing the data.
A researcher might run an experiment 50 different ways. 49 of those analysis methods show absolutely no correlation whatsoever, but one specific, highly customized way of slicing the variables randomly produces a statistically significant result.
So they're just.
The researcher throws away the 49 failures, publishes the one success, and pretends that was their original hypothesis all along.
That's awful.
It creates a scientific record filled with false positives that other researchers can never replicate.
And even when the research is conducted perfectly, the economics of how it gets published is an ethical nightmare.
Oh, completely.
The notes dive into the open access revolution and the double payment problem. Like, think about the last time you tried to read a scientific study about a medical condition or a new tech breakthrough, only to hit a $40 paywall for a single PDF.
It's infuriating. And the outrage stems from the funding model. A massive percentage of scientific research is publicly funded through government grants. Taxpayers foot the bill for the lab equipment, the salaries, and the data collection.
Right.
But when the study is finished, the researchers submit their findings to private, for-profit, academic journals, and the researchers are not paid for the article. The peer reviewers volunteer their time for free.
Wait, so the for-profit journal takes the free labor, slaps a copyright on it, and turns around and charges publicly funded university libraries exorbitant subscription fees to access the very research the public already paid to create.
That's exactly how it works. The taxpayers pay for the research, and then they pay a private corporation to read it.
That's the double payment.
Yep. And the open access, or OA movement, was designed to dismantle that paywall and make research free to read. But the sources highlight that OA created its own ethical traps.
Of course it did.
The debate focuses on gold versus green open access. Gold OA flips the financial burden. Instead of the reader paying a subscription fee, the author must pay an article processing charge to the journal in order to publish the paper.
So it makes the information free for the public to read, but it erects a massive pay-to-publish barrier.
Exactly.
I mean, a wealthy university can easily afford thousands of dollars in publishing fees. But a brilliant researcher in a developing nation or an underfunded institution is completely priced out of contributing to the global scientific record.
Yeah, it's a huge equity issue. Green open access attempts to bypass the journals entirely by having authors self-archive a copy of their paper in a free institutional repository.
It sounds better.
It is, but the gold OA model, where authors are just desperate to pay fees to get published, spawned this insidious industry of predatory publishing. Fake companies set up official-looking websites, take the author's fee, completely bypass the rigorous peer review process, and basically publish whatever is submitted. It pollutes the scientific record with unverified garbage.
Man. So to combat this, librarians are pushing for slow science, prioritizing rigorous methodology over raw speed and publication counts.
Yes.
The notes also contrast two entirely different approaches to data ethics: the FELM principles and the CARE principles.
Right. So FAIR focuses on the mechanics of the data itself. It demands that data be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable.
Okay, fair.
It's designed to prevent research from being siloed so that machines and other researchers can easily utilize it. CARE, however, focuses on the human element. specifically indigenous data sovereignty.
Because if the open access movement frees data from corporate paywalls, CARE ensures that the newly freed data doesn't simply get exploited all over again.
Exactly. Consider a scenario where a Western institution takes agricultural soil samples from indigenous lands, sequences the unique genetic data, and then patents the resulting agricultural technology without the community's consent.
Yeah, that's not okay.
The CARE principles, which stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, demand that data management respects the rights of the vulnerable communities the data is actually derived from. It's an ethical safeguard against the colonial extraction of knowledge.
Well, let's look at the terrifying bigger picture here. We have a digital foundation where ownership is legally shaky and files are literally rotting.
Right.
We have AI agents hallucinating and amplifying historical biases. And we have an academic pipeline producing our highest level knowledge, buckling under the pressure to publish salami-sliced, p-hacked research.
It's a lot.
It is. What happens when this massive, flawed pipe of information crashes directly into the general public?
Well, the result is an infodemic,
An infodemic.
an information epidemic, an environment so utterly saturated with data, both true and false, that it becomes basically impossible for the average citizen to navigate reality. And this environment exploits human psychology to spread.
Yeah, the sources outline the psychology of deception here. We are biologically vulnerable to confirmation bias.
Completely.
Our brains actively seek out and reward information that validates what we already believe, while aggressively filtering out facts that challenge our worldview.
There is also the mechanism of the illusory truth effect. Human memory is highly fallible. If a person is exposed to the exact same lie over and over again, the brain eventually forgets the source of the claim and begins to process the sheer familiarity of the statement as evidence of its truth.
That's terrifying.
Repeating a lie literally makes it feel true. Add emotional contagion to the mix, and the infodemic just goes viral.
Because disinformation is intentionally engineered to trigger intense anger or sheer terror. Because an enraged user clicks, comments, and shares. A calm user closes the app.
This brings us to a catastrophic failure in ethical design: algorithmic amplification.
Right.
The entire business model of modern social media runs on the attention economy. The algorithms driving the platforms are completely agnostic to the truth. They measure one metric: engagement.
Keeping you on the screen.
Exactly. If a piece of fabricated outrage generates more time on site than a nuanced factual report, the algorithm will mathematically amplify the lie to millions of people. The system is operating exactly as designed.
Yeah, and disinformation is weaponized by state-sponsored troll farms using this exact mechanism to sway elections or suppress dissent. And now, the infodemic is supercharged by deepfakes.
Yeah, deepfakes are changing the game.
AI-generated video and audio that perfectly mimic reality. The notes suggest the ultimate danger of deepfakes isn't just the fake videos themselves, but something called the liar's dividend.
The liar's dividend is so insidious. It is the mechanism by which deepfakes destroy the concept of objective evidence entirely.
How does that work?
Well, when synthetic media becomes so common and so convincing, the public becomes completely overwhelmed. They stop believing the fake things, sure, but more importantly, they stop believing true things.
Oh, I see.
If a politician is caught on a legitimate video taking a bribe, they simply invoke the liar's dividend. They claim the real video is an AI deepfake. And because the public knows deepfakes exist, the excuse works. Plausible deniability is granted to genuine corruption. Trust in reality erodes.
So the old checklists for spotting a bad website, like checking for typos or looking at the About page, are completely useless against that level of sophistication.
Entirely useless.
So information professionals are advocating for information literacy 2.0.
Right. And the core technique there is lateral reading. Instead of staying on a suspicious website and trying to figure out if it looks legitimate, you immediately open a new tab.
You leave the source?
Yes. You search what other independent, reputable organizations are saying about that source. It relies on the SIFT method. Stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims back to their original context.
But this plunges libraries straight into the most intense ethical debate in the entire field: the neutrality debate.
Oh yeah, this is a huge one.
Historically, a library is supposed to be a completely neutral repository for all human knowledge. But if an infodemic is actively harming people, how do information professionals avoid becoming the ultimate truth police?
The field is really wrestling with the transition from passive neutrality to active neutrality.
Okay.
Passive neutrality dictates that a librarian should provide all information, regardless of its validity, and let the user sort it out alone.
Like, imagine a patron asking for books on vaccines, and the librarian silently hands them a peer-reviewed medical journal alongside a known fabricated conspiracy pamphlet and just treats them as equal.
Exactly. And critics argue that passive approach makes the institution complicit in spreading harm. Active neutrality, however, argues that you do not censor the material, but you actively provide the necessary context. You label sources, you provide lateral reading tools, and you empower the patron to understand exactly what they're looking at.
But the tension peaks when an institution considers deplatforming, doesn't it? Like, if a speaker is known to spread weaponized disinformation, do you let them use the library's auditorium?
And that's where it gets incredibly difficult. Deplatforming forces professionals to balance two vital competing principles.
Right.
On one hand, you have First Amendment rights, free speech, and the core tenet of intellectual freedom.
Right.
On the other hand, you have the ethical imperative of harm prevention protecting the community from malicious content designed to cause real-world damage.
There's no easy answer there.
There is no simple equation and no political side to take. It requires impartial, rigorous ethical deliberation every single time an issue arises.
Man, we have traveled an incredible distance today. I mean, we started by exploring the loss of physical ownership and the creeping reality of the digital dark age.
We really covered a lot.
We did. We examined the biases of AI agents acting as our new intermediaries. We pulled back the curtain on the flawed, high-pressure pipeline of academic publishing. And finally, we waded into the trenches of the modern infodemic, where truth itself is basically under algorithmic assault.
If there's one overarching takeaway from these exam notes, it is that information ethics is the foundational architecture of our reality.
Yeah.
Building your own information resilience starts by understanding the systems you interact with. You must know how your data is tracked, how your algorithms are biased, and how to verify the claims flooding your feeds.
Absolutely. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, though.
Okay.
We discussed how AI agents are currently scraping massive amounts of human-generated data to learn how to predict the next word. But what happens in just a few years when the internet is entirely saturated with AI-generated articles, synthetic images, and deepfakes?
Oh, wow.
When the next generation of AI has to train on the hallucinated data created by the previous generation of AI.
The system just loops in on itself, a copy of a copy, degrading with each iteration.
Exactly. Will our digital knowledge base become a distorted synthetic echo chamber entirely divorced from reality? Kind of makes you wonder, if we don't own our digital books, if digital files silently rot away, and we can't trust the synthesized answers from the machines, maybe those ancient civilizations who took the time to carve their stories into solid, physical stone tablets had the right idea all along.
Honestly, consider that the next time a website asks you to accept all cookies.
Until next time.